In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have a brilliant conversation with Courtney Ehrlichman, the CEO of the Ehrlichman Group and co-founder of RoadBotics. We recorded this interview in early June of 2020. Courtney tells us about her background in urban studies, planning and transport, and her passions for community, mobility, and solving problems across industries. We talk about the concept of universal basic mobility and what a smart community means to Courtney, and why it's so important that technology is used as a tool to decrease divides and serve human needs. Courtney and I discuss how data can build wealthier communities and why efficiency is so important both from a local government economic development perspective and from a citizen user perspective as well. We have a great chat about autonomous vehicle shuttles and some of the moral, ethical, and labour issues associated with them, as well as the other complex pieces of the mobility conversation, such as urban density, land use, housing affordability, employment options, and lower tech mobility solutions like active transport. Courtney tells us how she sees America embracing smart community concepts and the pothole detecting tech company she co-founded, RoadBotics. We finish our conversation discussing the emerging trends people aren't talking about, such as food supply chain and educating citizens on their privacy rights, as well as some of Courtney's favourite smart community resources. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Courtney. How are you today?
Hi, Zoe. I'm doing well. How are you?
I am fabulous, and I'm super excited to speak with you today. It's been a long time coming, and, it's a very interesting time for us all, but I'm so glad that our technology is able to reach across the globe and we can have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've been very much looking forward to connecting with you.
That's awesome. Okay, well, let's jump straight in. Can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
My background is solving problems across every single industry, and I'm really passionate about having an impact for good. And at this point, now that it's 2020 and we're in a pandemic, I'm really into looking at what we're doing over the next 10 years as we are facing 2030, and we should be decreasing our carbon emissions. And I work in the transportation mobility field, so I'm really starting to talk to people about how we can move quicker towards that target while we're in this pandemic. How can we seize this moment to make sure that we're building back better?
And what sparked your interest kind of in this space? And I'll call it the smart community space, but specifically about mobility.
Sure. Actually, I've been working in the community space for a long time. I had started off as a bicycle messenger in college while I was studying urban studies and architectural studies and planning here in Pittsburgh at the University of Pittsburgh. And I just really felt like it was a new experience for me, having lived sort of in two different countries, both in England that had a much more village feel and in the suburbs outside of Pittsburgh. And I really felt like the bike was bringing me into the community. And then I started working in community development, doing some planning around small business and real estate development and affordable housing development. And the whole piece that was tying all of that together was this one main street road, and it needed to be completely reconstructed. And so I started working with the state DOT on how we could reconstruct it. It was very political, and it took years. This was 12 years ago, and that road is still being reconstructed. So just really understanding at that point how transportation is necessary to connect people. And then I was at Carnegie Mellon University doing economic development research there, and happened to stumble into the Robotics Institute and some people there. And I ended up working at the Traffic 21 Institute, where technology is developed based on problems that we were hearing about in the real world. So really driving technology development from a community-centered perspective. And then, smart communities to me really mean, smart in terms of equity, smart urban design, density, and also affordable housing, and of course, transportation that is connecting everybody. And I like to call that universal basic mobility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, universal basic mobility. I think that's a really interesting concept and something that I think we need to talk about more in this space, because mobility has to be the foundations of our communities, right? It's how we connect, it's how we access, it's how we get to work, how we get to education, how we even, decide where to live and decide what opportunities are available to us.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Universal basic mobility is the glue that binds us together. Obviously we need to exchange goods, we need to exchange our labor, we need to have homes, and there's this tremendous geographic mismatch right now. Even in terms of food, as we're seeing right now. I actually just came back from the grocery store and there was nothing on the shelves. So I really think that thinking of mobility as the foundation to our communities, to being resilient as a society, is actually very crucial.
Mm-hmm. So what is a smart community to you?
So a smart community to me is a community where everyone can live, work, play, and find their food in a way that they choose. So the streets are designed for not only, people our age, but children and elderly people. They can move around easily. Information and data is exchanged so that community planners and decision makers are making the right decisions, or they have the ability to make decisions faster with more information. And also, I think being smart includes being more efficient, but not necessarily being high tech, right? So I don't think that smart needs to be high tech. I think that we can, as communities, utilize technologies as a tool. And if they can enhance our work and free up workers to be doing higher level tasks and thinking and contribute more, and perhaps get away from their desk and actually, for decision makers, be in the community and engaging. And also, I think it's important that we figure out how to prioritize our land use in real estate and make sure that we have housing for everybody at all income levels. That's a big issue here in the United States. I'm not sure about how it is where you are, but we just don't have enough housing in our cities. And we have a lot of homeless people, a lot of people that are just getting pushed out further and further from the cities. And that means they're getting pushed out further and further from opportunities. They're not able to afford food. And we just have this growing gap. And it really comes down to, how are we designing our communities? And we're designing them right now in a way that creates more of a gap, that creates more distance, and doesn't actually bring things together and connect them.
Yeah, I think that the digital divide, then, being the financial divide, it goes hand in hand. And I think that's where this smart thing comes in, is I think people sometimes think that, it has to be super high tech. And if you're not high tech, then, you won't be able to operate in a smart community. But it's actually the opposite of that. We need to use technology to help the people, or to serve the people rather, with the most at stake. Because if we're not doing that and we're just increasing the divide further and further, then, it's not very smart.
Right. So technology that's just like a bright, shiny object, or, a headline in the paper, that doesn't matter. And what I've been finding actually with the actual smartest communities that I've worked with, they have a really strong organizational backbone. So they are able to involve data in their systems Whereas there are some cities and municipalities that aren't even modernized enough. They haven't gone through or been able to keep up with digital transformation on an organizational level to be able to even ingest data and information and utilize it in a cohesive way. So I think there's the digital divide, and there's also the digital transformation divide.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think like digital transformation was really thrown around a lot, maybe 5 years ago or something like that. And it kind of became, a buzzword term like innovation did. But the foundations of it, and without it, those companies, the government organizations are so far behind now because they, like you said, they aren't able to ingest that data and actually use it to make decisions. But also, the opportunities that they just can't even have, they can't look at now because they're still at that kind of foundational base level. But in saying that, like, I guess I don't want to say I guess it's behind, but everyone is on their own kind of, journey of smartness or whatever you want to call it to smart communities. And I think that's where, it's not too late to start. And it would have been great to start, however many years ago, but, the next best time is to start now. So I think that a lot of, when I talk to local governments, for example, it's like, oh no, we're so far behind, we can't even talk about that stuff. But that's not the case. The case is that we need to just start by looking at what are the pain points we want to try and solve. And if we were able to use data to actually make decisions about those, what are the things that we need to put in place to actually enable that to happen? So I think no matter what level we are on, we can always come back to the smart community concept and that thinking to actually be able to make real transformational change. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about this concept, because it has to be the way of the future if we are going to have these, equitable, clean, green, safe communities, because I just can't see another way that we can do this without, changing the way we're thinking and using technology as that enabler. But again, like you said, it's not always super high technology, super high advanced technology or anything like that. It's actually what will serve our needs right now.
Right. And I do think that a lot of technology, especially in my realm, I started a company out of the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon that uses smartphones and the cameras on the video camera to essentially detect potholes and cracking on roads. You just mount it to the dashboard and go, and it snaps some AI on the back, and there you go. You have it in 3 weeks. Whereas, in some communities, we were finding out that they were using, a clipboard and someone actually going out, and it would take up to 2 years to get a full survey of the whole city. And that's obviously just not efficient, not useful, because at least in my region, there's a freeze-thaw cycle every winter, and that affects our asphalt. But I think technology, what it really does is allow for all of this data to be collected, right? So then what do communities do with that data? And when I think about data, I think of it as a tool for wealth, building wealth in communities, because the more data you have, or rather the more data that is information that you can utilize and do scenario-based planning on, or you can just make decisions on investments, that really can transform a community. And when I think of a wealthy community, I think of one not in terms of, everyone's a 1%er, but everyone is healthy across the whole spectrum of incomes. Everyone can get access to food. They can get access to a job. They are not reliant on a personally owned vehicle. Transit is reliable and consistent, and your kids can play safely, and they can walk down the street or bike down the street or use different modes, and I think that's really important to understand, that the data and that is turned into information is very empowering and allows the communities that can ingest that data and utilize that data to build stronger communities faster than other communities that don't necessarily have access to the enormous amounts of data that are out there.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And I find local government very fascinating and really interesting, and also at the forefront. And the municipalities, I guess I call it in America, we call it here as well. But I guess, they're in the front line for this smart community thing. And I think that's where a lot of change can happen because they're at direct interface with the community. And I love making boring government processes more efficient. So, it's music to my ears to talk about potholes and improve efficiencies there and signage and that type of thing. And I'm an engineer, transport engineer by background. And we've been doing some work in that space as well, using cameras and AI to actually detect potholes and cracking and that type of thing, and working with local government. So yeah, really, really interesting stuff. But for the general community, I suppose, like maybe that's not super interesting, but the change that can happen within a local government by improving that efficiency, because they've done it like that for years, and it's not years and years and years and years, right? And so for me, like, it's not a surprise that it takes 2 years and, someone's with a manual clipboard, because I've worked in that industry as well, and actually changing to something that's different. But also then using that data, you can then do really kind of informed corridor planning, right? So then we can make better streets based on real data. We can have an up-to-date lay of the land every time that car goes out, or in our case, we've put them on a garbage truck. So every week, essentially, you get an update of the condition of the road. And I think that's where those type of things can really make a big difference. And also even within, like, internal to local government, if people can start seeing that, oh, okay, real innovation is happening here and it's, making a difference. And it's kind of, I think a lot of people get lost in the concept of smart cities, smart communities as being this kind of utopian thing. And until we get there, and someone else is worrying about it until we get there, and then we'll all live in this utopia kind of, Jetson fantasy land or whatever. Not to make light of it, but I guess some of these real engineering-y infrastructure things that can happen, I think we can get the people on board that really need to be on board, because they're the decision makers. And I think that's where we need to feed in all these different there's so many disciplines that need to come together to create these smart communities. And each will require a different level of engagement, a different level of, they'll have a different level of interest. And I think that's where we can really make a lot of change, when we do focus in on that kind of local government aspect and that direct dealing with the community, but then also the system behind the local government agency, or, even state government agencies, and what we can do to really increase efficiencies, make it, better use of resources from a sustainable level, and that type of thing.
Yeah, and I also think, Zoe, it's important to think about efficiency from the perspective of the citizen user. I'm very much a proponent and trained, and I even, I basically operate from human-centered design, and that's how I approach everything as a small community planner, and even just working in community meetings, hearing what they wanted on these different vacant lots and what the possibilities were. That wasn't for me to decide. That was for the community to decide how they wanted to interact with that space. And I really brought that with me in all of my work. And it's not about me having this great project that's going to win awards. It's about having a project or having a transportation system that actually serves people, rather than has this neat tech thing going on. Let's talk about, we should talk about autonomous vehicle shuttles, AV shuttles, the little guys. They call them the bread loaf vehicles now, because they all look like bread loaves. What problem were they solving? There's been so many deployments around America, and, what I saw from my perspective was that was really a way for different communities, different cities, different states to put a stake in the ground, an economic development flag in the ground, if you will, and say, hey, come to, savvy people, come live here. Look what we're doing. We have autonomous vehicles here. But of all of the AV shuttle deployments that I've seen, at least, I haven't seen any really operating on public roads that are solving a real problem. And so that's something that you can run into with technology, is technologies that are looking for a problem to solve, rather than technology that has been developed to solve a problem. And I think that's just where decision makers might not necessarily understand across the board what are the capabilities of technology if they're not trained in those fields, and might end up bringing on technology from a company that isn't actually serving the people. So it's really a hard nut to crack. I definitely think technology creates more efficiency and access to other resources. Specifically, you're talking about potholes, and actually the garbage truck concept was what RoadBotics, this company that I co-founded, that's our original sort of thesis, is you put them on garbage trucks because they go everywhere around a community once a week. So maybe we could talk more about that offline. But that's the one thing, is if we can cut down the largest budget line item that most communities have, which is paving. Like, that was my driving interest in starting RoadBotics, was how can we move those resources into other lines? Well, let's get real smart about how we are looking at the potholes and how we're doing our paving plans. Because right now, they're not necessarily the most efficient. And it is amazing to work with road managers and see them light up and get so excited by having this information in near real time. And then they can they can have better contract negotiations with whoever they're sending out there to actually fill the cracks and fill the potholes. And they can tell them, they can have a better plan for how much material they're actually going to need and use. And it frees up all these other resources. It frees up all these resources for other things to happen in the community. And that, to me, is efficient. And then using those resources in a way that may, enhance transit or access to food. I mean, I think there's these externalities that I would like to see when technology is deployed in a community, where it creates more opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that, using technology to create further opportunities. And I think that, and I love talking about roads and pavement, and because it's seen as, everyone's an expert because everyone drives on the road, but there's so many things that go into it, right? And also it affects all of our lives, no matter whether you drive a car or you're in a bus or you're walking or you're cycling or whatever. We all have to interact with the road network. And I don't want to talk about this too much, but let's talk offline, because it sounds like we're both passionate about how we can make this more efficient and effective. But I just think that, if we can then redeploy people into, I guess, higher or more interesting, or even just having more resources available to do other things, I think is so important. And I think, we're always talking about resource efficiency, and, that we never have enough resources, never enough time, money, effort. So I think if we tackle some of those really big challenges, like you were talking about, like pavement, for example, and I think some of the things that if we intervene at a certain time, you can actually extend the life of the road by X amount of years, which actually can save millions of dollars over, a large scale, etc.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You just don't let any water in. Let any water in. Extend the life.
Exactly. And I think, it's so interesting. Anyway, let's go on a little bit further around, we'll step out again into the kind of a broader aspect of how do you think America is currently embracing this kind of smart community concept?
Well, things have definitely changed as COVID has come down. One of the greatest things I think that happened in terms of America embracing the smart city concept or smart community concept was actually, I think it was 2016, the former Secretary of the United States Department of Transportation issued a Smart City Challenge, which basically, got all of the cities, most of the cities' attention, right? It was a $50 million pot. So everybody in these cities got together and started having conversations about what could they do. Cities that probably may not have been paying attention to how they could leverage technology to free up resources. They were all now creating a plan to do that. So Columbus won the Smart City Challenge, but all these other cities and communities are putting plans together that they now have these plans and they have a way forward. So they're starting to, actually turn those plans into action.
Yeah. I went to Columbus earlier this year to visit Smart Columbus. And you were talking earlier about the autonomous shuttles and how most of them aren't solving problems. I totally agree with you. But one that I did see in Columbus was the Linden Leap. And I think it was, and I'm not sure how it was affected by COVID, obviously, as well, but they worked with the community. So then it was on public roads and it was operating as, a public transport service. And it was going to take, they worked with the community around how the route was going to happen and when it needed to go and, the stops along the way and that type of thing. So I think for me, that was actually one where they thought about, okay, well, we've got this autonomous shuttle. What are we going to do? Like what problems can we solve and work with the community to have an impact in that community for them?
Right. And I actually have a lot of friends and colleagues that work in Smart Columbus and are part of making Linden Leap happen. Actually, Easy Mile was shut down for a little bit, actually, by NHTSA. There was some bump in the road, if you will, and they've just restarted in Columbus with, they now have seatbelts and there's a bunch of other things that they've done. And I think that's really fascinating that they found that AV shuttles were the solution to that problem, which neither of us have actually stated what the problem was they were solving. And it had been working for the last, 2 years. What is that more enhancing for the community because someone also has a job, right? I think there's a tough situation there. So I think that there's a lot of moral, ethical, and labor concerns to be thinking about with the AV shuttles that just haven't been answered yet. It's still very early on, and that technology is still developing. I know down in Florida, Voyage is doing a really great job with vans. Actually, they're moving around in retirement communities, which are vast in Florida. And so they're working with the elderly population who are in no rush and, are living where they are and could feel isolated if they don't have a way to get out of their house or have someone to drive them. And this is, that's creating an opportunity in that population. And I think that's a really great use case. But they're not using the shuttles. They're using actual vans. They're partnering with auto manufacturers to use vans. So it's just interesting to me. It's just interesting to me that there's a difference between the shuttles and there's a difference with the vans. And then you have buses too that also may be automated. I know there's a project in New Jersey right now for automated buses.
Yeah, no, and it's a really good point you bring up. I guess for me, if they've decided they're going to get a shuttle and they've got the shuttle, and then if they decide they're going to use it in a way that will be better for the community, then I feel like that's a point to them rather than it being a little bit gimmicky. But I totally agree with you because right now there's these problems that we're talking about that we're trying to solve. And if it is mobility, if it is that people can't get from A to B, then that problem can be solved right now. We can hire a driver and a bus or a van or whatever. And if that's the service that's available right now without any new technology, we can have that. But we don't. So what is the...
But you know what we do have? We have lots and lots of real estate on our streets that we all own together collectively. Mm-hmm. And what if we just built in more lanes and took more real estate away from the cars and had e-bikes and e-cargo bikes and, that were winterized. I mean, I've been up to a cargo bike shop in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where this incredible woman has this whole setup for winter. She's completely shielded. If you, look at Amsterdam, people are riding in high heels during the winter, and e-bikes have really opened and democratized cycling for a lot of people. And there's a huge shortage right now in our country. I think that is another way that we can not only just put people on a moving vehicle, but we can empower them to move around by themselves, right? And not necessarily need to rely. And, there's this whole issue with COVID and going back to transit and what is that transition going to look like? But I would really love, and in my mind, in a smart community, you've got this amazing backbone of transit that is complemented by modes like cycling, mopeds, clean electric mopeds, walking, and everything needs to be in a denser area. So you're not having to travel so far. You're not so far away from your job that you have to take 3 buses, right? Because you've been pushed out because the prices have gone so high. So the housing and building more housing really ties into that. in my mind.
Oh, I totally agree. I think the land use with where people are living and working, it has to be part of the conversation. And in a smart community, I agree, you shouldn't have to travel ridiculous amounts just to get to your workplace. And I went around the world and had a look at all this stuff and looking at like what are the pain points that people are suffering from in each of these places. What does the transport network look like? And yeah, being in Amsterdam, it's a brilliant place to be witnessing, I guess, in the sense of transit and cycling. But they're still, they're always trying to improve things. And that's what I found, that everyone is still trying to improve things no matter how good their current network is. But then on the flip side of that, like when I was in Mexico and, there's unregulated kind of minibus taxi things that are unsafe, particularly for women. And, they have to use these things to get in, and they travel, 2 hours a day or more just to get in because they have a service base, or a face-to-face like customer service job in the middle of town. And I think that there has to form part of the system. And I totally agree with you. Like what we need is a multimodal approach, which, if we are living on the outskirts and in the current environment, then we need to feed in a longer trip plus then, maybe a shared bike or, walking, cycling, whatever. Walkability has to be part of the solution. I guess like what I was getting at was people are waiting for autonomous vehicles to kind of solve this big problem that we have. And I think they can.
They're going to solve everything, Zoe.
Yeah.
They're going to solve everything.
And I just think like right now, and I think there's definitely a component in there around safety, but I do feel like that connectivity, so connected vehicles and connected modes.
Oh yeah, I'm always like, if we just rolled out 5G, edge computing, all the cars were connected. I mean, it's like we're going to have collision avoidance, and you have advanced driver, watching the driver or, notifying the driver, ADAS systems. We can reach that level of safety now. We can be doing it now. We can incrementally be making it towards the safety argument, the safety solution. Sorry, I totally just...
No, totally. I guess that's what I was going to say, that we don't talk enough about the connectivity, and you don't even necessarily need 5G. You can use the DSRC plus, other mechanisms depending on the latency that you require. But I just think like that if we start talking about that conversation, but it's not as sexy as the AV one, that we can actually try and solve some of the problems that maybe we're not even articulating because we don't know what they are. But we know that there's some problems and we can't quite work out how AVs are solving them, even though everyone's telling us that they are.
Right, and it's the telecom side, right? Whether it's DSRC or 5G, and I'm a proponent of both at this point. I think there can be a blend solution. Yeah, me too. What I can say is that I think that AVs got overhyped, way overhyped. And I think that auto manufacturers got really scared about the timeline that was originally put out there, and really thought that they were, going to have their lunch eaten by these AV companies. And we're just seeing that's not the case, right? So I've been very glad to see a lot of my colleagues in the transportation industry here, ITS America specifically, like really still pounding the pavement on connectivity, DSRC, and really sort of holding to that line, because I think, as the AV timelines have been pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, and we've seen the failed deployment timeline. And now with COVID, where is the investment going to go right now? Is it going to be going into this long-term investment in technology when there's so much pain right now in business finances for the auto industry? I think, I'm just really glad that the part of the industry has still been walking down the road rather than rushing and chasing autonomous vehicle technology. So I think we can get there. I'm hoping, here in the States, we're going to need some, federal funding around that. We're going to need some regulation. We've got an FCC that might take our spectrum away for the safety messages. So there's a lot at stake right now. I'm just hoping we don't miss our shot.
Okay. That has been a really great conversation. Thanks for having it with me. I really enjoy talking about this, connected AV stuff, but in a way that's not just like, oh, this is the best, so it's going to solve all of our problems. High five.
High five.
Let's talk about you now. Tell us about the things you're currently working on.
Sure. So many businesses are looking to break into the mobility space through product development or, investments, or people that are making investments struggle to make decisions because they lack access to the latest industry disruptions and trends, or having their finger on the pulse. But, when you're on the ground, you need a higher level view. So because you can't be the only well-informed person and be able to act on that information. And so what I do is I help communities, startups, VC firms, and corporations navigate the mobility industry, develop products for the market, and invest in technology that positively impacts communities. So essentially, when you have access to the proven insights, connections, and strategy you need to make better decisions, you can position your product to win in the marketplace, you can invest in the right technology, grow your business, and ultimately we can better serve the community. So I work in a few different sides of the mobility industry, but my position is really a bird's eye view, figuring out, I like to think that I have an understanding of how the different actors in the industry are talking and what they're looking for. So I know how an investor is thinking about how they want to invest in a startup. I've co-founded a startup. It's, RoadBotics is now 3 years old, Series A, 7.5 million, and in over 200 cities around the world. So I know how to help startup founders navigate. They've got a lot on their plate. They need to break into the market. They don't know necessarily, they need to refine their problem discovery. I really love helping people ensure that they're solving the right problems and while they're developing their technology. I work with different states to help them understand while they're going about their workday, they can't focus on all of the developments in the space and what other states are doing, what technologies are coming up, and the best solutions. And now with COVID, I really help them understand basically the landscape of technology, policy, funding, what's going on at the federal level with the stimulus, and what communities are doing and what they need. So I talk about transit. I also talk about like AASHTO, the state funding, talking about what's going on with privacy, and data privacy is very interesting and very interesting to states, what's going on with the spectrum debate. I talk about what's going on with data, just like how are different communities utilizing data and what is that data providing to them. So it's really all across the board. What I'm really excited and what I'm talking to a lot of people about right now is taking this moment where our social world has essentially been ripped open, and we are trying to figure out how to re-enter society safely, interacting with each other. So, and all of this money is being thrown around to reboot the economy. So while we're investing right now, how can we do that in a way that is not only a short-term solution, but longer term, right? Like we've got 2030 ahead of us with this 1.5 degrees Celsius target. So how can we actually transform and accelerate our transportation community, look at the supply chain, make it more nimble while we're doing this, while we're solving these short-term, very painful problems.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It's been so great to chat with you. I've just got a couple of final questions around, I reckon we could talk for a few hours. We'll have to have another conversation soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
But what are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
So I do think the emerging trends that need to be talked about more is the supply chain, the food supply chain. There's, all across the supply chain, it's a very rigid, and we're hearing about farmers like dumping their milk or burning their produce. It's not getting to market because we've got such tight we've just got a tight chain. And I think we're going to need to be moving to a more regional model. And so that's going to unfold, and that's going to unfold over the next year. We're not seeing it necessarily right now, but it's going to continue to break down. And that's a big, big logistics. And it's a big issue for poverty as well. It will impact a lot of people negatively. Also, I think we need to just keep elevating the conversation about the climate crisis. And then the other piece that I think is really important is the data privacy piece. I think people need to be educating themselves about, the right to protect their individual travel trips. So, there's a big fight right now in the States between Uber and LADOT. LADOT wants the access to individual trips through scooter sharing, e-scooter sharing. And that's, in my learning, in my education at Carnegie Mellon in data privacy and privacy policy, that is a no-no. And that's something that's been talked about since, the early 90s. So I think people really need to get on top as a society of what their rights are and what privacy means. It's very hard to sort of put our hands around, and it can become a slippery slope. But that to me right now is a very pressing, one of the biggest issues that we're seeing and facing right now.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's going to become more and more, it's already super important. I feel like we are kind of lagging behind, and we always have been, I guess, in understanding and making sure we're informed around privacy. But then, yes, the regulation to protect people that don't necessarily, it's not front of mind all the time. But the more that we are talking about data and using data, then the more privacy needs to be designed in from the very beginning. So then we can avoid some of these things that have had to have conversations and make actions on.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree.
What are some of your favorite smart community resources?
In terms of...
What do you read? What do you consume resource-wise?
So I am a big fan of Riley Brennan's newsletter. He runs Trucks VC, and he keeps a great finger on the pulse. He sends out a weekly newsletter. I also listen to the Otonacast, which is Alex Roy, Ed Niedermeyer, and Kirsten Karosek, who are just three fabulous, wonderful people. And they're not always in agreement on things, and that creates some really nice tension. And Streets blog is one of those. I read The Information. I read City Lab, of course, The Atlantic. I'm constantly looking at different reports that are coming out from the Transportation Research Board, and just looking at case studies and finding a lot of information from conferences, which is really important to me to stay in conversation with the professional community.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been so great to chat with you, Courtney. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Zoe. This has been wonderful.
I just have one last question, which is how can people connect with you?
They can find me on Twitter. My handle is @C_Ehrlichman, which is EHRLICHMAN. I'm sure you can find it in the notes here. My website is theehrlichmangroup.com. I'm on LinkedIn, Courtney Ehrlichman. And yeah, those are the best ways to find me.
Excellent. We'll put the links in the show notes so people can click away and find you. Thank you again for coming on. And yeah, I look forward to talking to you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Zoe.
Thanks, Courtney. Bye.
Bye.
The Smart Community Podcast is brought to you by My Smart Community. If you're looking for support in podcast strategy and production, workshop design and facilitation, or communication and media advisory, get in touch. Email hello@mysmart.community or head to www.mysmart.community.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, You can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.